Welcome to this episode of Mind the Gap, Making Education Work Across the Globe, with me, Tom Sherrington, and my great partner, Emma Turner. Hello, Emma.
Hello, Tom. Are you well? I'm very excited, by the way, about tonight.
Oh, yeah, me too. So we've been actually wanting to talk to you for ages, and we've finally got around to getting you on the show. So big warm welcome to Professor Rob Coe.
Hello. Yeah, it's a great honour and a pleasure, and I'm also looking forward to it.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, I mean, you're someone who, in this sort of research engaged chat world, is someone who I've been aware of and sort of followed for must be at least 10 years now. I think we first met on a jolly to Washington DC.
Oh yes, gosh, we could talk about that. Yeah,
I know. And I think that was the same year that the Sutton Trust Great Teaching report came out, and there's lots of things I want to talk to you about that. So that's how long, I've been aware of it. But also worked before that with the Chem Centre in Durham and data and stuff. So you've done so many things, and you've been someone who's got a lot of people want to come and see your sessions at Research Ed. So it's a great honour to have you on the show. For people who are not sure about what your work is and who you work for now, do you want to just give people a bit of a summary of what you're up to and who your partners are?
Yeah, I mean, it's always quite difficult to do that, I think. So my official titles are that I'm the Director of Research and Development at Evidence-Based Education. Evidence-Based Education is a small startup based in the northeast of England. Sunderland is the office. I think there's 14 of us now, something like that. And we are basically about supporting teacher learning, teacher growth, teacher development by using research evidence, I guess. I mean, that, in a sense, everybody's doing that, so that maybe doesn't tell you much, but that's the day job. And I work 4 days a week for EBE, so that's most of my time now. I'm a senior associate at the Education Endowment Foundation, and that means I just do bits of consultancy really here and there and little pieces of work for the EEF. I've been involved with the EEF really from its beginning in 2011, I think it started. And, I think it's a great organization. So really happy to be part of that. And I do other bits and pieces as well, sort of freelancey stuff for different people. And but I would say, if someone says to me, what do you do? I'd say I'm a researcher. I was a teacher for 7 years. I taught maths in secondary, and then I became a researcher. And if I'm talking about anything to do with education, it's not because of my skill as a teacher. It's because of my knowledge of research, I think. And you can be sort of tempted to stray into giving advice about things that aren't really within your expertise. And obviously, I try not to do that, but it does blur in, what is research, what is practice, and in some ways that's one of the really interesting questions about how does what do we mean by something like evidence-based education, or how does research evidence play into how much notice of it should classroom teachers take, and so on. What do they need to know?
Well, it's great. I mean, I think your contribution to our community of educators and teachers is brilliant, because we don't have that many researchers who are kind of known, and communication of ideas is important, isn't it? There's lots of names that are sort of cited in papers that people refer to, but then you're someone who's kind of accessible and part of the community, and it feels, and that to me is great. And I think the fact that you've been a teacher before, I mean, do you feel like that has helped you? I mean, you're not drawing on it. You were a teacher and you know what it's like to do the work.
Well, yes, I think so. And I do, I think that's an important part of my identity. I'm not sure. I always, if I say it, I think, does that kind of gain me any kind of credibility at all? I mean, it was nearly 30 years ago that I was last working in a school. And quite a lot has changed since then. So I never, Ofsted had just started, but I was never inspected by Ofsted. There weren't really league tables at that point. 1995 was when I stopped being a teacher. It was a very different world. We did have GCSEs, but again, when I first started teaching, the first year I was teaching, it was still O-level. So,
wow.
Lots changed since then. And so I don't know what does that give me still. I think it does give me a bit as just the kind of knowing what it's like to work in a school a bit is quite important. I think people who've never worked in a school, there's some quite sort of basic things that they struggle to understand. I mean, the way schools operate is bizarre, isn't it? And if you hadn't worked in one, you're not going to think that would be the sensible way to do things.
Yeah. So Emma, so what's? I mean, I could wax lyrical for ages here, but what's your kind of way into hearing about Rob and knowing what he does?
I'm just still smiling at the fact it said does bits and bobs for the EEF, like some of the biggest, largest, most far-reaching, hard-hitting pieces of research that are cited by teachers. Just a few bits and bobs that made me smile. Okay. No, I think that my kind of first dalliance with Rob's work and the work of Rob and his colleagues was the Great Teaching Toolkit, when it kind of really pulled together so much thinking and put forward both the research and also the articulation of what lots of people were doing but hadn't got a name for, hadn't got that shared understanding of why what we were doing was working. So I found that was hugely useful, working with early career teachers, working with colleagues. I just found that was my first kind of introduction to your work, and then obviously have fallen down multiple rabbit holes ever since. Delving ever deeper into your wider work, Rob.
Yeah, that's brilliant. No, I mean, it's lovely to hear that when anyone working in a school says, "Oh, I read this thing and it was really useful." It is incredibly gratifying to hear that, and I never get tired of that, and I never take that for granted. I just think that's really important. I mean, you were saying earlier, Tom, about how there aren't a lot of researchers who are really engaged with that world of teachers. And I think that's true. And I think it's a real shame, actually. And I think the way the sort of teacher researcher as an identity has come out, it didn't used to be a thing at all. When I was a teacher, in fact, I left teaching to do a PhD, and I was pretty sure I would go back into school with my PhD and just, pretend I didn't have it, or, be a bit embarrassed about it because it wasn't going to get me any favors. People would just think, "Oh, who does he think he is?" It wasn't something that it wasn't a sensible thing to do if you wanted a career as a teacher. And I think that's changed a lot now. I think, teachers are writing books. I mean, goodness knows how many books are there written by full-time teachers or working classroom teachers. And really fabulous books as well. They're not just sort of drivelly rubbish. There's some really, really good ones out there. And just the kind of things like Research Ed, where you get, I don't know, what is it, 800 teachers or something in a room together, and they're all talking about research on a Saturday. I just think that's extraordinary.
It's fantastic. In fact, I'm going to ask you about a couple of your talks recently, because you're, like a headliner, and some of them, you really provoke people's thoughts. So this is what I want to ask you about this now, is actually because it's about the sort of nature of research and what value it has to people. So there's a few things where I feel like we've been on a bit of a journey over the last 10 or so years, where you've got sort of like principles and kind of concepts, as someone like Dan Willingham would present, like, here's some ideas about memory, for example, and then that's at one end, and at the other end you had this sort of period, I would say largely popularized by John Hattie, which is a kind of measurable effect size idea, and the EEF still uses a kind of an effect size idea, where you sort of have this idea that a particular technique has been studied and it's been shown to have this effect compared to this other technique, which therefore, so you've got this sort of precision or kind of suggestion of some precision. Then you've got general concepts. And then as you coming along to Research Ed saying sort of crazy things like, we don't really know very much about this. So I'll unpick that a bit for us. What can research tell us really about things that teachers do?
Yeah. So so if we separate out John Hattie for a minute and just talk about the EEF Teaching Learning Toolkit, and there are effect sizes in there, and they talk about months of gain as the metric. Now, when I talk about that, and I was involved in the original version of that was really the thing that got me started on doing work that resonated around schools, I think, in particular, and that led to the What Makes Great Teaching report, which was launched at that event in Washington that we both enjoyed. And then the Great Teaching Toolkit, in a way, was the the sort of follow up to that as well, 5 years later, refining that. So, but the EEF Teaching Learning Toolkit is not about, I don't think it's about, and doesn't try to be about, this technique versus that technique. It's about specific interventions, and that's a really important distinction. So where people have identified a choice of things you can do, an intervention is a conscious, deliberate, explicit choice to say, let's do a thing. And usually an intervention is more than just a choice that a teacher makes. Well, shall I do a retrieval quiz this lesson or not? Usually it's about more of a package, a program. And mostly what EF evaluates are programs, and mostly what's in the evidence that contributes to the effect sizes in the toolkit are programs. So they're more of a kind of whole thing. Often there's bits of training involved, there's materials, they're a package. And that's the thing we can evaluate. What's really hard to evaluate is much more of the kind of everyday choices about, I can see a few students at the back of the room not really paying attention. Should I do A or should I do B? Where A and B are two real things you might consider. And I'd say mostly we don't have a lot of research that can answer that kind of question.
That's really interesting, because I was reading an overview of a lecture that you were giving, and it mentions in the blurb about the importance of developing teacher intuition. And I really wanted to ask you tonight about what your thoughts are on how you develop that intuition. Is it innate? Is it developed? How do we refine it? Because I'm guessing that's what helps you to make those choices in the moment.
Exactly. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So intuition is really interesting. It's something, we all have intuition, don't we? We have those gut feelings. We have that kind of immediate response to things, often in situations where we've reacted before we've even realized we had a choice, or we've made a choice or a decision, and often it's quite subconscious or below the level of awareness. And when you think about classrooms, that's so much what you need. I mean, they're such hectic places, they're such busy places, there's such an overload of cognitive load. It's just far too much. You can't process it all because you've got so many people doing so many different things, and things can just go off the rails so quickly. And it's almost always, if you have to stop and think about, well, what am I going to do here, you've missed it. It's too late. You haven't got that time, and you also haven't got that brain space to do it. So intuition has to be your friend here. But on the other hand, when you talk about intuition, of course, we know that there's lots of cognitive biases, and gut feelings can just be wrong more often. And one of the cognitive biases that we all have is to be more certain about our intuitions than we probably should be. For example, we trust them much more than we maybe should, and that's because we're human beings. That's not because we're bad. So it's a really tricky thing. But there's also really interesting research about what intuition is, and expertise as well, different kinds of expertise. And intuition, I think the way I think about it is that a lot of this draws on Robin Hogarth's work, for example, is that it's really just experience distilled. It's memory of pattern recognition of having seen similar things before. And, the last time I was in this situation, I did this, it didn't end well, so I'm going to do something different. Or last time it did end well, and I'm going to do the same again. And so we're recognizing patterns in situations, and we're learning behaviors that we've done before, essentially, and making those well-trodden paths that then become the natural thing that we do without having to think too hard about what we do. Because again, one of the characteristics of human beings is that we don't like to have to think too hard. We like to just do stuff that's easy and obvious. So intuition is our friend there, provided that we have enough experience and enough valid experience. And again, Hogarth talks about kind and wicked environments, the idea that some environments are good for learning in because you get good feedback about whether things are going well or not. And so you can improve, you can learn from it, feedback that's inherent in the situation, and that helps to build the intuition that you need. And in a wicked environment, you either don't get much feedback, or you get feedback that's misleading or unhelpful or meaningless. And so then it's really hard to learn, and you sort of plateau. You don't actually improve. Experience doesn't turn into improvement. And my claim is that classrooms in their natural state are more wicked than kind. At least once you get past the certain point of learning the basics. So I think beginner teachers very quickly, or not very quickly, but reasonably quickly learn how to manage behavior, for example, or most of them do. And part of the reason for that, and they improve massively when you see them come in new, they're terrible mostly, not all. I know some are sort of natural geniuses at it. I was always terrible at it. I really had to struggle to learn how to manage behavior and manage a classroom. And I got a bit better, but I didn't get as good as I think I could have been. But one of the reasons people do get better is you're immediately getting really good feedback about whether what you're doing is working in relation to managing the room and managing students' behavior. But in relation to some other really important things, like is anyone in this room actually learning anything? It's really, really hard to get good feedback. Because learning's invisible. It happens silently inside people's heads. There's no obvious sign of it. So that's really how I got into the poor proxies. That was another.
I was going to ask you that. That was like, that was going to be my next question, because to me that is like, right up there in the Prof Coe, like top 5 all-time greatest hits.
Yes.
And it's probably one of the conference slides. If you had to rank the most tweeted conference slides, your poor proxies one, and it came from that Sutton Trust report sort of celebration tour, because I'm not sure if it's something explicitly like that in the report itself, but
yeah. So it came out of just sort of unwinding the history. So the first thing, as I say, I think was the toolkit stuff, which is just basically, so that came about in 2010 was the first version of that. And it was because there was discussion. There was an election in 2010 in England, and all 3 parties were talking about this idea of a pupil premium. That was new then. We hadn't had it before. And they had slightly different notions of what it was and how much money it was going to be and so on. But slightly naively, perhaps, we thought that this might be extra money for schools. And that they would, therefore, there was a kind of free choice. There would be some level of free choice about, well, how do we spend this extra money? And what the Sutton Trust had done some surveys and polling and focus groups and things of school leaders, and the things they said they would spend it on were, we'll have some more teaching assistants or some more teachers so we can have smaller classes. And we knew, this is Steve Higgins and myself basically, that those were both quite problematic in terms of, not necessarily bad things to do, but if what you wanted was to help more students to learn more, they were both likely to have quite small impacts and likely to be really expensive. So there were almost certainly better things you could do with a small amount of money than hiring more teaching assistants or more teachers. So there was a mismatch between, I think, reasonably good and clear evidence about what are likely to be best bets for spending a bit of money, and what most head teachers said they would do with it. And that's why we did the toolkit originally, to say, well, here's what the evidence says about class size and about the impact of teaching assistants. Some of that was quite controversial because it basically said they don't make any difference. There wasn't a lot of good research about teaching assistants, for example. And there's been a bit more since. And I think what we know now is that they do, or certainly can, make a positive difference. It's not huge though. And they are quite expensive compared to other things. So, these are trade-offs. I don't think the position has really massively changed on that, but it has changed a bit. And it was controversial and still is controversial. And, it's an example of where we need to be careful about oversimplifying research. But that the things that the research says are effective are things like feedback and metacognition interventions and that kind of thing. And people would say, and I'd present this research to teachers, and they would often want to argue with me, which I love. I love it when people argue with me. And they would say, well, how you're saying class size doesn't make a lot of difference, but you're saying feedback really does. Surely we can give better feedback if we have smaller classes. And, how is it that that seems like a contradiction. And those discussions got into talking about pedagogy, basically. Well, if you've got a class of 30, are there strategies that you can use to give students feedback, or to get feedback from students about what their current levels of thinking and understanding are? And, my question would be something like, well, if you've got a strategy that you think could work with a class of 15, but couldn't work with a class of 30, then tell me what that strategy is. And nobody could, because there aren't, there are strategies that could work with a class of 5 that wouldn't work with a class of 30. But basically, if it works with a class of 15, it's pretty much going to work with a class of 30. And no one's talking about reducing class size below 15, because, if you go from 30 to 15, you've more or less doubled the unit cost of providing education. And even in 2010, when there was lots of money in schools, nobody thought that was possible. So it's not really on the table, I think. And so that pedagogy discussion, sorry, this is a rather long answer, got into thinking about, well, what exactly is, what's the point of being a teacher in a classroom? It's about learning. And some of those discussions with teachers seemed to me that they weren't really focused on learning. So they would say, like, well, I can give more attention to students if there aren't as many. Yes, you can give more attention. Does that mean more of them learn more? Because it may not, and giving them attention, it seemed to me, was just a quite a weak proxy for the assumption that they'll actually learn more. They might, or they might not. And that's really where that list came from. It was, here's some things that came out of discussion, or I'd heard teachers say about that they thought were good things that they were perhaps aiming to do in their classrooms. And I think perhaps sometimes a bit of a distraction from the really important thing, which is getting students to wrap their heads around the ideas that we want them to learn and understand, to think hard about hard ideas.
So it's amazing, because then you have to think about, well, what a good sort of this idea of proxies for learning, full stop. It's the idea. I mean, I'm going to read it out now, because this is a slide I've got in front of me. It says, 4 proxies for learning. Students are busy. Lots of work is done, especially written work. Students are engaged, interested, and motivated. And thinking, damn, not even that. Students are getting attention, feedback, and explanations. I like this one. Classroom is ordered, calm, and under control. The curriculum has been covered. And then not this one. At least some students have supplied correct answers. That's like saying, and it's kind of such a bubble bursting list. You think, oh God, so you have to go way beyond this, don't you?
What am I left with? Yeah. I mean, I've always tried to make clear, and it is one of those things that people don't understand. I suppose I haven't made clear enough, but those are all good things. They're not, none of those are things that I wouldn't want to see in a classroom. If I go into a classroom, it's better if it's calm and ordered than if it's chaotic and crazy. It is better if students have done some writing or some work. It is, all of those things are good. It's just that they're no guarantee. So they're sort of necessary, but definitely not sufficient.
I remember, Rob, sitting there. It was my first year of headship, 2010. I remember sitting there with that on my desk and going, oh, your date. I'm thinking, how do I have this conversation with staff now about, I've just taken on this role. How do I actually sort of throw that hand grenade into the conversation and say, this may all look really lovely, but it's not necessarily moving children's thinking forward. So I just, when you said 2010, Tom, I had a little flashback to my very
right.
that kind of brings you on to, so if they're kind of the poor proxies, and then you suddenly realise that you might have a bigger job on your hands. I wanted to sort of talk about implementation, because there's a lovely line in something that I read that you'd said about tiny and the effect of tiny and slow changes. Because sometimes you, as a head or as a senior, you read a report, you think, I've got to do it, I've got to do it now, I've got to do it quickly, it needs to have been in place by yesterday. So it was just your thoughts really on, so you found this as a leader, you've stumbled across, or you've found this information. How do you go about kind of reining it in and doing things in that sustained, cumulative, slower way?
Yeah. Well, so school leadership is a little bit of a mystery to me, if I'm honest. I've never been a school leader. I have written a review about school leadership, or the research on school leadership, so I feel like I've jumped a little bit into that pool. But as far as giving school leaders advice about how to do that, I don't know. I do think one of the things I see, though, is that there's a kind of action bias in this, that which we feel compelled to do stuff, and actually often what's more effective is not to react to things, certainly not to overreact to things, not to try and add new things to do as well. Quite often I think what schools need is stuff taken away, so that they can really pare back and focus on the basics. And I know that's really, really difficult to do as a leader. I do have experience of that as well. And I think that genuine improvement is mostly very slow and steady. It's incremental. It's not transformational. There's not a big bang. I think sometimes you need that big bang. Sometimes you need to get buy-in, and you need to see dramatic change. And there are some aspects of leadership, when schools are really in chaos and behavior is just terrible, and the way everyone feels about the institution is really gone down, then I think sorting out some of those things and re-establishing some norms and rules about behavior and those kinds of things, that can have a really dramatic effect quite quickly. But that's just creating the hygiene for the learning to be able to begin. That doesn't directly impact on learning. And learning is the most important thing. I keep coming back to that. I think it's all the other things are in the service of learning, really. It's about what's going on inside children's heads.
Which is why, tell us a bit about the process that went into developing. So in evidence-based education, you've got a whole program out there, which is, another toolkit, Great Teaching Toolkit, GT. Yep. A lot of people are talking about that and using that. But it's sort of supported by a model for great teaching, which is a kind of framework for understanding teaching. And It's got these 4, I think you call them dimensions.
Yeah.
I'll list them out. They're understanding the content, which I guess is curriculum, creating a supportive environment, which is like behavior and other things.
Yeah.
Maximizing opportunity to learn, which is interesting because that's a slightly subtle one around, again, linked to behavior. But the main one, which is the bigger one, is activating hard thinking, and that to me is just like a genius bit of phrasing there. But those 4 areas, really, when you look at it, it's like, well, there we go. It's probably, I've said this when I sort of first saw it, like the best sort of A4 capture of teaching I've ever come across, to be so succinct and yet so kind of thorough at the same time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What was the process to devise that?
Well, so the foundation was the Sutton Trust report, the What Makes Great Teaching from 2014. And that was an attempt to try and start looking at the research on pedagogy and what teachers do in classrooms, and what we know about the activities, the strategies, the behaviors that are likely or most likely or best bets, best evidence that we've got. These are the things that contribute to more learning happening. And there's a fair bit of research on that. And we looked at intervention studies, so where you try to change how teachers behave in classrooms, for example. We looked at studies that are more correlational, so in schools where this kind of thing is more common, or in classrooms where this kind of thing is more common, students are learning more. And we also looked at the kind of fundamental psychology research about how learning happens and what we know about the mechanisms, if you like. And where we found convergence, we tried to put that together and say, right, well, these are the things that look as though they're best bets. And that report had a big impact, partly, I think, also because we put in it some things that don't have an impact. So things like lavish praise was the expression that people picked on, which we all like and teachers love to give, and it can be right to give praise, but it can undermine learning, actually, and often isn't that helpful for learning. And you have to be careful about how you do it. Well, I suppose that's true of most things, but I think this was some of that was a bit controversial. For example, learning styles was another one we put in there, which still people think that that's a good idea. But, you know, it was already clear long before that it wasn't really. So anyway, but that was 2014. And then various points in the years after that, I thought, well, we should in fact, almost before it was published, I thought, well, we need to update this because there's some, you know, I found a new study or there's something else that I hadn't quite thought of. And that's always the way, I think, when you publish a report, you think, oh, if only I'd put that in. So that was always on the agenda. I had a little notebook full of, you know, updates when we do them. And when I started working at evidence-based education, that was in 2019, we thought, right, well, it's coming up for 5 years. Maybe we should do an update. And so we started thinking about, right, well, what would that look like? And I think one thing that I had in mind was to improve the way we communicate that overall structure, you know, to try and break it down. And there was lots of really good research from Germany and the US and Norway and, you know, many other countries where they have these convergence of models about the things that make a difference, and they're broadly the dimensions 2, 3, and 4 of the model. So the relationships, which is dimension 2, the maximizing opportunity, which is really about managing a classroom and behavior. And then, as you say, activating hard thinking, dimension 4. Those are in a lot of models. The stuff about the curriculum was a bit more specific to England at that time because we had this much more talk about the curriculum. The new framework from Ofsted, for example, was very heavy on that. And lots of people were thinking hard about their curriculum, I think probably driven by Ofsted. But it does matter. You know, it matters that what you teach obviously matters, but teachers' knowledge of that curriculum, their knowledge about the kinds of misconceptions that kids will have, and their ability to come up with good questions, for example, good assessment items or good questions around content. And all of that is quite content specific. So, you know, if I've taught, I don't know, thermodynamics lots of times, then I'll have a repertoire of really good questions to ask students. I'll know where they get stuck in that topic. And then if I'm teaching, I don't know, ionic bonding or something the next week, I may not have taught that for a couple of years and I won't have that same subject knowledge. So I'm still a chemistry teacher, but, you know, there's some bits that I know and some bits that I don't know. So that's, I think, basically added that in. But what we did in the process of then writing that, what became clear to me was that another review that just sets out a model is not really going to help anyone. You know, it's nice to have and people like to have it, and it provides a basis for a discussion, having a model that says these are 4 things that matter. We can split them up a bit further. There's 17 individual elements listed under those 4 headings. And if you want to get better as a teacher, then focusing on one or more of those 17 things is quite likely to be helpful. Focusing on anything else is a lot less likely to be helpful. That's the kind of simple message of it. But what it doesn't tell you is, well, supposing I want to get better at, you know, element 5 or whatever, how do I do it? How do I get better at you know, building relationships of trust and respect with students if I don't have that? Or even if I do have it, I can still improve it. How do I get better at establishing routines in a classroom if that's not something I'm currently doing? How do I get better at using questioning to help me understand what's in my students' heads, and therefore to make my teaching more responsive to that? And the answer is you need a whole lot more support. And that's really where the whole Great Teaching Toolkit idea came from, which is that you need tools, you need structured learning activities, courses, you need feedback tools. That's a big part of my thinking for all the years that I've been a researcher, that as I say, classrooms inherently don't give you great feedback. So can we sharpen that? Can we enhance the feedback you get by using things like student surveys, for example, asking the children their perceptions of what's going on in classrooms? Not every teacher is going to be up for that, for sure. You have to be a bit brave. You have to be a bit robust. It can be a bit bruising, what students will say to you. But mostly it's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's very. I mean, I think it's because Emma, we've had this discussion a few times that a model, a kind of reference point, is helpful to even just develop a shared understanding between a group of teachers about what the problems are that we're trying to solve, and then, of course, they have solutions. And today, I was talking about continuous provision.
Welcome to my world, Mr. Sherrington.
I was at an ethics school yesterday where the continuous provision there was pretty spectacular. It went up to year 2, so there's and so I mean, Emma, so do you find these sort of frameworks are as relevant in early years as they are to a sort of secondary maths teacher?
I think that it's quite tricky to say this works in this space, this doesn't work in this space, because there are elements that are all transferable but not necessarily directly congruent. So there will be times in early years or times in Key Stage 1 where you will have children all together, and so you're going to need strategies for dealing with a larger group. There'll be other times where you're working in provision where you're trying to elicit children's understanding of what sense they're making of their play or their interaction with the environment, where you still need that repertoire of rich questioning and knowing how to elicit thinking from children. So I think that it's not a kind of an all or nothing yes or no. It's knowing as a teacher how do you develop a great understanding of what great questioning is, or what great modeling is, or what great scaffolding is, and then in your phase thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to sit all the children in rows all afternoon when they're only age 4. That's not appropriate, but I still need to ask these children great questions to elicit their thinking and to move their thinking on. So how can I use that toolkit to apply it in my context? And I think one of the problems that essentially happens is that phases try to replicate each other rather than actually respecting the stage of development of the child.
Yeah.
And saying, like, this is what we know about kind of cognitive science, this is what we know about teacher development, and this is what we know about child development, and let's look through all the lenses to see which bits I need to apply in this context for this child in this phase. But it's not a case of this is for secondary, this is for primary, this is for early years. I may have got that totally wrong. That, Rob, you might be about to correct.
No, I agree. I agree, and I think it's really important. I mean, so one of the caveats I would say when we're talking about what does research tell us about teachers' practices or classroom practice is that most of the research comes from broadly sort of middle years. So in the US, say grades 3 to 8 in elementary schools. In mainstream schools, again, as I say, mostly in North America. So if we're talking about early years, if we're talking about special schools, if we're talking about even older children, certainly post 16, but even Key Stage 4, we're extrapolating from research that's been done in quite different contexts. Now, I think that's always problematic and we should always be careful. But to be honest, whenever we try and think about how to apply this, we're extrapolating. And I think the key thing is that context is really, really important. It's about what does this look like in my classroom with me as, the person I am, the style I have, the relationship I have with those children, the context around me, their history, their community, all of those other things, they make a difference to how you translate the principles into specific kinds of practices. And what I think I find in general is that the principles seem pretty universal. You talked about, say, questioning. That's important in any teaching, isn't it? Right from preschool through to university, we use questioning. It's different types of questions, for sure, handled in different ways. The relationships between the teacher and the student, those are important. There has to be trust, there has to be respect. That's true, again, whether they're 3 years old or 18 years old or whatever. And so I think at the level of principle, these are pretty universal. I mean, there might be some contexts where certainly the weight you put on them will vary. So in some contexts, building those relationships is the most important thing to get right first. In other contexts, it's about getting them to think hard. In both contexts, it's about both. but your priorities might be different according to how you read that context, you know, your history, your relationships, and so on. So teachers have to be able to make those judgments. And, you know, there again, we come back to intuition, we come back to expertise, that there are no recipes here. You can't say, follow these steps and everything will be fine, because, well, rather like with recipes, actually, you know, two people follow the same recipe. It's very rare that they'll produce exactly the same dish, because there's a lot of stuff that's unstated in a recipe about what you do that isn't spelt out in detail, and individuals bring different things to it, and, you know, maybe their ovens are different temperatures or whatever, but you know, a recipe doesn't fully define the whole thing. So I think it's the same with teaching, that you have to have that expertise, like the person who understands when they read the, you know, beat the egg or whatever, what that means. The same thing with the teacher who you know, is reading, let's say, reading a walkthrough and thinks, right, okay, I can visualize how this works. Without some expertise, they can't actually.
No, you're right.
And so part of what we have to do is to build that expertise, that judgment about, you know, we talk about the why, how, when, and with what. So they need to understand, well, why does this work? How does it work? You know, when should I use it? What else has to have happened first? If I change it this way, will it still work? Some people think those are, you know, we need to squeeze out those adaptations, or they worry about lethal mutations, that the teachers will turn it into something that doesn't work. And of course they might, but I think it's inherent in teaching that you adapt stuff. You can't just follow it, you know, like a script. You have to be able to do it your own way that fits your context, and therefore you have to have the expertise that allows you to make those judgments appropriately.
Interesting, isn't it? Because there's a line. This is like my daily conversation about the line between a mutation to, like, it's not, you know, like watching recently, sort of seeing some teachers where they're using whiteboards, which is good, but then the whiteboard was like 1 between 2. So one of the kids was basically watching their friend do the answer all the time. Okay. You could look at it close up and say, look at that kid just going, oh yeah, nice work, mate, you know, like to their friend. And you're thinking that's changed the purpose. Mm-hmm. But then there's a difference between that and an adaptation, a teacher with a certain character and a bit of a kind of je ne sais quoi about them, like doing their thing. And you're thinking, well, look, no one else can be that, but look how they've made that work through some of sheer force of character. So I want to we're going to run out of time before we know it. I want to ask you about this whole thing about the research you've done into teacher development, and the kind of the last year's research at Bombshell, which was you know, is instructional coaching kind of the new brain gym? And the answer of your talk was no.
Yeah,
I spent an hour fretting, thinking that you're thinking, oh my god, you know, he's going to say it's all rubbish, but you didn't. You said basically it's difficult to get right, and kind of therefore often isn't what it says it is. But we haven't got that much time. But what's your sort of message around that you'd like people to sort of explore further, maybe?
Well, I partly think what I was trying to do was to puncture a little bit of a bubble there, because it seemed to be it's become a bit of a craze, and people are talking about it a lot, and lots of schools are doing it. And it always worries me when these things become suddenly very popular, because I think, well, the evidence on this hasn't really changed. You know, if it was a good thing to do 3 years ago, it's still a good thing to do now, and if it wasn't, it isn't. So those sorts of sudden changes are always, I think, a cause for a little bit of concern, or a bit of a flag. I think, I mean, there's lots of good evidence about coaching. We can call it instructional coaching if you want to. I'm not sure that makes any difference, but it definitely can be effective. In a lot of research studies, it has been effective. Not in all. So in some studies, it turns out to be a bit disappointing. And I think my concerns about it are that it's partly about the scalability, that in order to do, it's a really quite an expensive thing to do. It's a bit like class size, you know, it does increase the amount that students learn. It's just very, very expensive to do. And coaching, I think, can be the same, especially if we're going for one-to-one. And, you know, a lot of models do specify that is how you have to do it. So That means the person who's doing it has to find that time to do it. Who are they? Well, they're likely to be some of your best teachers. So we're taking all our best teachers out of the classroom to give them time to do this support for other teachers. And it might be that it has such a big effect that it compensates for taking all our best teachers away from the direct impact on children. But I'm not sure that I'm convinced about that. And I think the kinds of skills and expertise that you need to be a great coach are, first of all, we don't really know enough about what they are. But secondly, they're almost certainly in pretty short supply, like all expertise. And so I worry what will happen when people are doing this role because they think it's what they need to do, but they don't really have the skills and expertise to do it well. It's a bit like your example with the whiteboards that, people could see that and they could think, yeah, that's great. You're using mini whiteboards, but actually it's not quite working. And it takes quite a lot of skill to even just to be able to see that perhaps, and certainly to think about, well, here's a suggestion, or getting them to understand what, see their own classroom a bit more faithfully, or whatever it is you think things. I think they're just quite hard to do. So just a bit of caution around it. I think I'm not saying it's a good. I mean, if I'm in a classroom and I have a chance to be coached by Tom or Emma, I'm going to bite your hand off. I'm going to say yes, please, and help me. But if it's my colleague who is probably no better than I am, I might think.
So Emma, has Rob dented your faith in coaching, or does that caution ring true for you?
No, I think the caution is very necessary. If you're going to do something, you need to do something from a really informed standpoint, where that you've got the skill and the expertise of the people in the room to make it work. I think saying you're doing something because you think you need to be doing it isn't necessarily going to have the effect that you want it to. So if it's done with time, care and skill and knowledge, then great. But if we're just doing it because we think we've got to do it, there's probably other things we could do that might have a little bit more of an effect.
And just wishing that Rob, you'd done that talk about 4 years ago, so that when we published our walkthroughs guide, we didn't call it a guide to instructional coaching on the front cover, because it's sort of like we're sort of like, in a way, a bit sort of riding a wave, I should say. And probably we should have just said a guide to professional learning or something a bit more broad, because what you're basically saying is do it. I think you end up sort of advocating more of a kind of group approach, don't you? Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's our kind of working hypothesis, and I know you're also looking at this, aren't you, in your work with workthroughs, that and there are various models for this. So I think Dylan Williams' work on formative assessment, embedding formative assessment as based around groups of teachers collaborating together. There's really interesting work from a researcher called Jenny Gore in Australia, who's done great work on this as well. And they're all just trying to explore how to make collaboration among teachers work. And collaboration, it's a bit like coaching as well. Collaboration can be terrible. I've been put in groups with teachers to do stuff and just thought, please swallow me up, world, because this is terrible. And it doesn't work well. And lots of evidence about different kinds of collaboration and things like interventions like lesson study. Again, I think the evidence about that is a bit mixed. It's quite an attractive idea, but again, I think it just depends on having the expertise in the group and the focus on the right things in the group. So my hypothesis is that collaboration is the way to go. But we've got to harness that collaboration. We've got to structure it. We've got to inform it. So make sure there's enough expertise in the group. Make sure there's a kind of reference point, that a model, if you like, that people can come back to and say, well, is this worth doing? Is it in the model? Is it likely to be justified? Do we know enough about it? And when we've got those safeguards in place, then I hope we'll find this is an efficient way to help teachers learn, because human beings are by nature collaborative. We like to work together. We like to share stuff, and we work better when we're not just on our own trying to improve our practice, but we're with a group of colleagues with a common agenda about helping each other to improve our practice. And that feels a more sustainable model in a real school, that, you know, you could find time for a group to meet occasionally, you know, ideally say once a fortnight or something like that, but realistically it might be less than that. And those people, if it's a reasonably structured meeting, they're helping each other. If they've got feedback tools that help them to see their classrooms more truthfully, then hopefully this helps them. But as I say, it's a working hypothesis, and you know, ask me back in a couple of years and I'll tell you if we've got good evidence that it is in fact working, or how we've changed it in response to the flow of evidence coming in order to try and optimize it.
That sounds like massively sensible. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, I'm feeling I've got a big inner interior smile here, because today I was in a school in Hackney today, and that's exactly what they do. I mean, they you know, we went there a term ago. They set up these sort of groups of 3 people with a kind of leader, and there's a kind of like expertise in the room. They have cycles of 3 weeks, and then they do a clever process of all the people in the group watch another person, so they don't just, there's feedback from all sides, and then they like, and you go back in there today and it's like, wow, look at that, look where you are now. It's so great to see, and there's a collaboration. It's not all like one-to-one, it's collaborative, and it's working. It's great.
I think that feels more sustainable. It's more of a shared responsibility. I think you learn from, you know, if you, again, observation, we haven't talked about that, but I think that's another thing that's really difficult to do well, I think, to observe another lesson and make correct inferences about what's going on, what's working. But having people do that, you know, is a learning experience for them as well. And so the whole thing, I think, kind of pulls itself up by its own bootstraps. That's the hope. You know, we'll see how sustainable it is, how effective it is, whether people like it, and so on. You know, it's got to meet all those criteria.
Amazing. Okay, well, look, I mean, I think we've come to the end now. Our producer's like, we're running on. It's like, oh gosh, okay.
Waving his hand, saying, "Cut."
There's so much to talk about. Honestly, I knew this would be great, and you've got so many kind of, you know, ways for people to engage with what you're doing. And I would recommend to people listening that, you know, go and check out the evidence-based education website for a start, and look at the Great Teaching Toolkit for your school. Even if you just, you know, browse through the model, which is fantastic, but the support package and stuff is amazing. And of course, you know, Education Endowment Foundation, still a great source of these studies and a great sort of source of discussion in schools. So look, thank you so much for everything you've done over decades. Being such a great sort of active member of our education community. I think it's superb, and I'm looking forward to the next bubble you're going to burst. God knows what it will be.
Okay, well, that's really kind, Tom. I appreciate that coming from you, because I think you're definitely also somebody who's made a massive contribution in all sorts of ways. I mean, the you know, books, the walkthroughs, the blogs in the days when people used to write blogs. Well, both of you, absolutely, and just doing this podcast as well. It's a great service, actually, and the fact that people want to listen to it, I think, is wonderful.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And we know we get great feedback from people all over. The person I was working with today was saying she listens to our podcast every Saturday. She goes for walks on the beach. So, so thank you very much. Thanks so much to Professor Rob Coe. And thanks to Emma, as always. And we'll see you again. We've got some great guests lined up. Thanks for joining us. Education, mind the gap. What's our phrase?
That was slick, Tom. That was really slick.
Making education work across the globe. That's it. I mean, that is, I can't even remember our own tagline.
It's good that you've been practicing that, isn't it?
I know. I mean, I'm a slick pro, as everyone knows. But yeah, there we go. See you soon, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Mind the Gap. I'm Emma Turner, and I've been presenting with my co-host Tom Sherrington. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, share on social media, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on our YouTube channel, search for Mind the Gap with Tom and Emma, or head over to Spotify for an audio version. This podcast was produced in association with Haringey Education Partnership, and our producer for today's episode was Luke Kemper.